Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I am really sorry that I didn't have a chance to do an introduction video highlighting and telling you guys about the 6 books that I will be reading for this next round. So instead I'm just going to go straight into the one vlog video, which is this video, and obviously go through the 6 books that I have been given and my wrap up and thoughts as I go along. So I have been put in the Quaterfinals Fiction Group A category this time round, which had in it Night Crawling by Layla Motley. Off the top of my head, I've got an ebook, so I haven't got it to hand. So hopefully that's the author's name, rings a bell. The Book of Goose by Yi-Young Lee, Trust by Hernan Diaz, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell, and Fellowship Point by Alice Elliott Dark. Those are the 6 books that I have been given. I am in May and I've finished 2 of the 6 books now, which is not great because usually I've finished about 4 of them by the end of the first month. So I still have a little bit of time, and I am just going to dedicate a lot of time this week to getting stuff done. But I'm going to tell you the 2 books that I did read. So I have read The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell, and this is set in Italy in the 1560s and follows Lucrezia, who ends up marrying a duke. In Italy, it's kind of an arranged marriage. Her sister dies and she was betrothed to this duke, and with her dying they make an agreement that Lucrezia will take on this marriage, and she will fulfill this obligation. And throughout the book she kind of seems to have this feeling that she's going to die, that he's going to kill her. And I believe that this story is roughly an inspiration from a poem, a famous poem that talks about this particular duke in this period of time, and his wife dies under mysterious circumstances. Don't quote me on that, I haven't done any research, I just know that it's roughly based on kind of a poem and she's kind of elaborated the story around it. This book feels very like Hamnet, her other novel, her kind of most recent novel that was published just before this one. I know she's written a few historical fictions and I think she's very talented in that area, and this is kind of her comfort lane. She's kind of found something that she excels really well in, and again, like Hamnet, she took some real historical events and she took inspiration from them and created her own narratives from them, and particularly looking at characters that were overlooked in those historical periods and in those historical stories. For example, Hamlet doesn't focus on Shakespeare, and in this book it touches on the Duke, but it's mainly about this very young girl who's married to this fully grown man who seems to be very abusive, and she's trapped in a situation. She is part of a big family and she has a big connection to animals, and she is an artist, and she kind of feels lost in the Duke's world. She doesn't seem to fit into his circle as well as I think he anticipated or her parents expected, or she herself had very different notions of what was going to happen. And surprisingly, the story does ramp up and then we kind of find out it's a sense of impending anxiety over this, leading to this suspicion that he's going to kill her and whether he does, and the tension laid out in that is really palpable and interesting to read. But that's essentially the narrative, and while that sounds like that's a story that doesn't go very very far or seems quite simplistic, Maggie O'Farrell has a real talent for storytelling. Now this book was about 400 odd pages, 450 pages, and she can keep you immersed and gripped that whole time. And she really helped me become invested in that character of Lucretia and her maid and her day-to-day living and the emotions that she was feeling. And the other smaller characters were still really intriguing. I really wanted to tap into them a lot more, and she makes you very drawn into her stories. I'm sure people can talk more eloquently about the talents of Maggie O'Farrell, so I'll just stop waffling on that one, but I gave it a solid 4 out of 5 stars. I think I just loved Hamnet more. I think I just had a natural connection with that. From the beginning I just kind of fell in love with that book very quickly, but this is a very strong book to come after it, and I'm very happy with giving it a solid 4 stars, and would highly recommend this book. I'm going to recommend it to my mum because I think she will love it as well. So yeah, very happy with that. And then the second book I read was The Book of Goose by Yi Young Lee, and I've literally just finished that now. And this is a really interesting book to contrast against The Marriage Portrait, because this book follows 2 girls in 1954 in France, and they live in this kind of village community. They are peasant girls, and between them they start kind of writing a story. One of them just kind of writes it down, and the other one comes up with ludicrous ideas for a story. And this leads to, so one of the girls is called Fabienne, and so Agnes ends up writing the stories down and Fabienne creates them. And then along the way Agnes and Fabienne get the books that they've written published, but only under Agnes's name. So she's only 14, so she becomes this kind of child prodigy writer. And the city of Paris, a publisher, becomes interested, and then a lady from England contacts the Paris publisher to ask that she join a finishing school in England to refine her skills. When she gets there, she essentially, they believe an older man has helped them write the books, and nobody really knows about Fabienne's help or creativity. And when she gets to this finishing school, she hates it. She doesn't want to write books anymore, and she kind of like throws the opportunity away and says, yes, the postmaster wrote them, it's got nothing to do with me. And she fades back into obscurity in France, and lives an unremarkable life after that point. But the relationship, the kind of whole story focuses on the relationship between Agnes and Fabienne, and almost how a friendship has a stronger impact than a romance. It does kind of speculate and hint potentially that there are romantic feelings between the two of them, and they're aware that that relationship can't progress in a romantic setting. But it's kind of like this obsession with the other person. Agnes is obsessed with Fabienne, and she talks about her in kind of hyperbolic and obsessive ways, and they kind of, when she comes back from the finishing school, their relationship fades into obscurity, but Fabienne had a really big impact on Agnes's sense of self and identity, and she's reflecting back on that. But what I think is quite interesting posing them together is that both stories on the surface are quite simplistic, but whereas with The Marriage Portrait, even the simple element in that novel of the title comes from the marriage portrait. The Duke wants the Duchess to be encapsulated in a portrait, a professional portrait done properly, that is going to be her marriage portrait. Even that I found really interesting, having the painters come and things like that, and things that usually wouldn't be interesting to me. Maggie O'Farrell wrote in a way that it was full of tension and intrigue. Yi Young Lee can write really well, and this was a fantastically well written novel. There was nothing wrong with it, but I found I personally was disconnected from the characters of Fabienne and Agnes. I didn't have, I could see what was being presented. I was expected to feel a lot of emotions about their internal relationship, and I could appreciate that on the page and the effort that went into that. I just found that I couldn't fully invest in it. Something just took me out of it a little bit. So yeah, on the surface I think these two books are very similar, and I think it just depends how your gut reacts to them. I think a lot of people will really appreciate the beauty of this book, but I noticed that even Robert, who is the judge for the Booktube prize, he must have read this book a while ago. I looked on Goodreads and I think he had a bit of a similar experience to me. I think he felt like he knew he was expected to feel something from this book but just didn't. And I do think, if I'm brutally honest, after just finishing it, that in about 2 months' time, if somebody asked me what this book was about, I probably would struggle to tell them, because it was a plot that moved forward but not significantly, so there wasn't a huge amount of plot points. It was all kind of about character relationship, which I usually love if done properly. So I think I'm going to give it between 3 and 3.5 stars, because it's beautifully written, and I will, you know, I will seek out more from this author. Where Reasons End is something that's been on my TBR for a while, and I'd happily read that. I just think this didn't really grab me in the feels in the way that I think it was meant to. So obviously at the moment The Marriage Portrait is in top, and then The Book of Goose is underneath that. Then I have Trust by Hernan Diaz out the library. I'm currently on page 36 of this, so very early on, and this is quite a big book. This is 400 pages. And then I have Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. This is again another chunky one. This is 546 pages. Then I have Night Crawling, which is about 350 pages, and Fellowship Point, that is 580 pages. So I think the reason I've become quite anxious about the prize is that some books are quite small and you can tick them off quite quickly, but at least 3 out of the 4 left to read are considered chunkier than the average. They're not the just average 300 page read that you would kind of expect from fiction, because fiction tends to be nicer in that regard than non-fiction. Non-fiction can be anywhere, but it is an exciting bunch. I've noticed that Trust has had a lot of buzz in reader circles, but also in literature circles, so that's really good. And I've just noticed that Demon Copperhead has won a prize, winner of the Women's Prize for Fiction, and I swear it's just won something else. It might have just a few days ago won something else because my auntie sent me a message, but maybe she was just reiterating that. But so a lot of literary acclaim is in this group. I think The Marriage Portrait, that also got some good praise, and they're obviously all over the internet as well as being well regarded, so I think it'll be interesting what shuffles out in this category, because they're all of a high calibre. I can already tell that. But anyway, I'm going to round up the waffle now, so I will check in with you guys when I've read at least 2 other books so that we can talk about something. Well, me ramble and you listen to my discussions on wrapping up the next 2 books. Hello everyone, so I'm just going to give you a check-in with the books and where I'm up to. So I have now finished Trust by Hernan Diaz, and this was a really interesting novel. I think the rating I have given it has kind of heavily leaned on the fact that it is really creatively structured, and how it's kind of a bit like a Russian doll. It has a story within a story within a story that by the end of the book allows the full picture for the reader of what's going on. So this is kind of set in the 20s and 30s in America, in New York. And the first story that we get access to is called Bonds by Harold Vanner. And that is a fictional story of 2 people during the 1920s and 30s, a man who marries a woman, and he's really successful during the 20s, and he kind of avoids the repercussions of the Wall Street crash. And it's kind of just mainly about them meeting each other, their relationship. She gets, in the story, she gets quite mentally ill, and they take her to a sanatorium, and she dies from treatment there. And then the next part of the book is about, it's written by Andrew Bevel, and he ends up meeting a lady called Ida, and he basically wants her to work on his autobiography for him, to kind of transcribe what he says and to rewrite it in an entertaining way. He kind of goes through interviews to acquire her, and he basically is really angry with this novel Bonds that Harold Banner wrote, because he thinks it's a dig at his relationship with his wife Mildred. He says the representation of mental health was inaccurate, that his wife Mildred died due to cancer, and he's really angry that essentially he thinks his life has been fictionalised and misrepresented, so he wants Ida to rewrite his story and right a few wrongs. So he's kind of rewriting this in direct response to the fictionalised novel Bonds. So the next two sections, we kind of see the drafting from Andrew of his novel, and we get a section from Ida of how she came to be his biographer, and how she got this role, and their relationship. And then the last section of the novel focuses on Mildred, who we kind of get access to her diary at the end, and we kind of learn the full picture from that section. Now that section was my least engaging section out of the four, because it was written in kind of messy scribble. It was meant to be like a diary. There were some entries that were really well written and others that were just kind of jotted down notes. I liked the creativity of having the jotted down notes and it kind of looking like these were works in progress. But the last section had a lot of sparse text that felt a bit sloggy to get through. But overall, I think I would give it 4 stars, because I've never read a book quite like this. The way it was structured, what it was aiming to do, this kind of story within a story was really effective. And I will give it 4 stars because it was focused in the world of financing in the 20s and 30s in New York, something which I have no real interest in, but I felt compelled every night to carry on reading this. I read this over like 3 or 4 nights, and to have that keep coming back to it ability holds it in strong stead. I think it's very, very clever. I know it's getting a lot of praise, and I think it is justified because I have never read anything quite like this, and I think for that reason it will stick with me. So I'm going to give that 4 stars. I think where I'm going to place it for now is The Marriage Portrait is going ahead of it. So we're going to have in first place for right now The Marriage Portrait, then in second place Trust, and then in third place The Book of Goose. And then I am currently reading Demon Copperhead. I've just taken the dust jacket off the hardback because it's just a lot easier to read that way. And I'm currently 133 pages into this. Absolutely loving this so far, which is really exciting because this is kind of the biggest beast on the list, really. So I've got really high hopes for this one, but I'm not going to say too much yet because it's way too early. But I will say that for fans of Shuggie Bain, although this is set in the 90s in America with Demon Copperhead, there is a lot of parallels between this and Shuggie Bain, which was set in the 80s in Glasgow. But the characters feel quite similar and the journey seems quite similar. So I'm really enjoying that because I absolutely love Shuggie Bain. But I will also caveat that I have not read David Copperfield. I have it on my nightstand and I really want to read it once the judging's done to try and compare this kind of modern adaptation of it. But just to let you know, when I give my final thoughts and rankings, it will not be with the knowledge of any of the events in David Copperfield or read with that kind of lens, unfortunately. So I'm sure other people on this prize will have read it and that can inform their feelings on it, but for me that will be absent, just to let you know. And then I'm also reading Fellowship Point on my Kindle. I am about 21% in on this. Again, really like this. I think it's a really interesting story of the lives of the characters in Fellowship Point. I will give you more on that because obviously once I've read the other 70 odd, 80 odd percent, I'll have a lot more finite and concrete things to say about it, but really enjoying that. And then after that I just had Nightcrawling to read, but that's the shortest out of the books still to be read, so that can go to the end. But I will just say I'm quite excited to see how things shake out because this is an incredibly strong fiction category. I think this might be one of the strongest fiction categories that I have judged throughout my entirety of judging the Booktube prize. Some of them are quite chunky as well, but the calibre and the talent in these books is so high, so it's going to be very hard to pick my top 3 because most of these should go through. But obviously that's the way that the Booktube prize kind of pans out. Sometimes strong contenders in one category, 3 have to go. It really shakes up where our final result ends up. But anyway, I will catch up with you when I have read Demon Copperhead and Fellowship Point so I can wrap that up, and then I might just do a final clip after that of my thoughts on Nightcrawling and then my final rankings. So I'll see you then. Bye for now. So this is my final clip. I am going to tell you about the final 3 books that I read for this judging round, and I will give you my final rankings for this quarterfinals fiction round. So I'm going to start with Nightcrawling by Layla Motley. So this is a story about a young black woman living in poverty in the US, called Kyra or Kiara, can't remember off the top of my head. I read this as an ebook, so I don't have it to hand, so I'll obviously put a picture up here. And she's struggling. She lives with her brother. She has a hard set of circumstances. So her mother is in a halfway house. Her mother tried to commit suicide, and she neglected her youngest child that was a toddler at the time. And in the complex of flats that they live, they had a communal pool area, and the child unfortunately drowned. So she lost her mum to a halfway house, and her very young sister died. Her father is also dead. He died from cancer and he was in and out of prison. So at the moment she lives in the same complex of flats with her brother. Her brother thinks he's going to make it as a rapper, and he's spending a lot of money trying to make this dream happen, and we kind of become aware later on in the novel that he's funding this through drug dealing. And their rent has just gone up, and Kiara is struggling with being able to stay living at the property. She's asked him, her brother, to get a job, and he just can't seem to hold one down, and she kind of waits tables or a restaurant or something like that, or a grocery shop, something like that, but she's not earning enough, and she hasn't got a solid source of income. So she ends up turning almost accidentally into prostitution, and then the police get involved with kind of dangerous consequences. It gets darker as the police get involved. They almost pick her for selective police only sex parties and things like that, and this book really explores sexual exploitation of black women, sexual exploitation by the police. It is incredibly violent. It discusses topics like drug use and rape, and it doesn't hold anything back. So this one and Demon Copperhead, which I'll talk about in a little minute, they were incredibly bleak subject matters. I think this was really well written. This was a debut from the author. I have decided to give it 4 stars. I think it's incredibly strong. I deliberated a few days ago about where to put everything, so I've kind of already decided when I film this clip. So what I'm going to do is give it 4 stars, the same as Trust and The Marriage Portrait, but I'm going to put it under Trust. So I'm going to have The Book of Goose, Night Crawling, Trust, and then The Marriage Portrait. Purely because I think overall Trust was doing something different. It was playing with form, and it was something I'd never quite read before, so I think purely for that reason it is going above this novel, Night Crawling. Now, I know for a fact that Night Crawling has blown up. It's been really well considered. I know this author will write more books, which I will definitely try and read. I think this author has a long and successful career ahead in writing novels. I was blown away how strong this was as a debut. I just think as well, purely because there was a lot of bleak books in this selection, that I'm happiest that it's sit here overall. So that's what I thought about Night Crawling. I then read Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, and this is quite a chunky book. It's about 580 pages, something like that. And this just completely blew my socks off. So this is set in the noughties, in the Alpaca Mountains in the US, in the kind of the southern state of America. The southern states, not great on my American geography, but I know it's the south of the US that this is centred in. And it follows the character of Demon Copperhead. Now, this is a modern retelling of David Copperfield. I've never read it, but I think from my personal experience, you don't really need to have read it, because I haven't, to get lots out of this book. It's a modern retelling. So this follows the character of Demon Copperhead. Through some circumstances, we meet him as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old boy, and he kind of tells us the history of his life. He does briefly talk about the period of when he was born, because it has the famous first line on it, "First I got myself born like a blue prize fighter." So he talks about that, about how his mum told him the story of how he was born. But we start the story with Demon having no father, with his mother having drugs and alcohol abuse issues. She meets she meets a new man, gets a new fella who doesn't get on with Demon, and this results in her death, and the stepdad doesn't really want anything to do with her. He tries to get adopted by the neighbours next door, who he kind of has a relationship with for the rest of his life, the Peggotts. But they have lots of young people in their family that have ended up being looked after by other family members due to their parents also having drug and drink issues or being in prison or things like that, so they don't have the capacity to take on Demon. Then we have a section where he kind of goes through the foster system, and that's really, really heartbreaking and difficult. We kind of go through his adult life, his kind of teenage years through to his early adulthood, characters that he meets that stays with him, and we kind of see him struggle to find his wings. This book was just so beautiful. It's so bleak. Like Night Crawling, it is so tough to read, but it is so gorgeous. Like the way that Barbara Kingsolver writes is just stunning. And Demon Copperhead to me felt very like Shuggy Bain. It was a character that I instantly fell in love with, regardless of his faults. I was infuriated throughout most of the book at the way the adults in his life let him down. There's a heavy section about the opioid crisis, because no spoilers, but some characters get involved with that, and it's a seething look at that, and that was an incredibly frustrating part of the book as well, because again, that was how people were being let down by physicians and medical experts, and then it's created such devastation in people's lives. It is hopeful at the end, this book. A demon is a character that I wish I could just fall into the pages of this book and check he's okay. He definitely had a lot of parallels with Shuggy Bane. A lot of things happened to him, and they shaped him, and he was just a beautiful character. I absolutely just fell in love with this book, just wholeheartedly and completely. Gave it 5 stars, as you can obviously tell, and spoilers, this is going to be in first position because nothing knocked it. And I really want to go and read Barbara Kingsolver's backlist, because the way she wrote about things, her language choices, the way she wrote sentences was just gorgeous. But more than that, she is an older woman, and the way that she managed to talk about a young boy's experience, talk about this really difficult upbringing that he came from, and just be bob on with it. Like, this was a fully fledged character that can be seen all up and down the US, and not just in the early noughties, in the current climate that we're living in. This was a fully fledged character that just walked off the page, that was genuine, that was complicated, that was nuanced, that had so much going on. I just didn't expect to be blown away by this. I was really apprehensive to read this because it's so big, and it wasn't what I expected at all, and it really was just incredible. So this was 5 stars, easy. And then the final book I read was Fellowship Point by Alice Elliott Dark. And this was a nice relief set against these other 2 novels. So this was also a chunky book. It was about 600 pages, and I read it on ebook, so it took a little bit of a while to get through it. But this was just a beautiful and wholesome story. And I fell in love with these characters, and it just felt like a beautiful escape. Like, I enjoyed going back into the book because it was calming, in a way that the other 2 books were very stressful, but thoroughly enjoyable. All 3 of the books were enjoyable, but this one felt like putting on a cosy pair of slippers. I could really viscerally see Fellowship Point and the characters in it, and I wanted to be walking through the woods with the characters, so I'll tell you what it's about. So this book was also set in the early noughties. A host of characters that live in the cottages of Fellowship Point in Maine. So it follows predominantly 2 women in their 80s, Agnes and Polly, and they each have a cottage in Maine. Their great-great-grandfathers were Quakers from Philadelphia, and they built this land in Maine. They wanted to have this setup where their families would directly inherit the cottage, and it was to give back to the land and blah blah blah. So Agnes and Polly have ended up with their own cottages, and obviously from their great-grandfathers all the way down to them, the families have lived there. Some of them have another home throughout the year, but they come every summer and they bring their children. So the whole cast of characters in the story have kind of known each other a very long time. And Agnes and Polly were fantastic characters. They were both in their 80s, but they were so full of life. And we learned through them things that happened in the past, characters that are no longer with us, like their parents and their siblings. We also go through a storyline in the novel of Polly losing her husband, and we kind of learn some secrets about what happened to other characters, And there's also a second commentary running throughout the novel, kind of about who owns the land and what the land means, and the idea that Agnes and Polly have been taught that they inherit this land, but then they kind of learn that the indigenous people originally had the land, and that their great-grandfathers took that land and built on it. And so Agnes, towards the end of the novel, thinks, actually, I've had this sense of ownership of this place for so long, and I don't own it. It belongs back to the people, back to nature. And that was a really interesting thread that ran through the novel as well. But I love, like, the tenacity of Agnes. She is kind of a spinster, but we find out a lot about how she came to that. And she is a writer. She writes children's books that we learn were inspired by somebody she knew previously, a young girl who had a huge impact on her. And she secretly writes adult books under a pen name, and people don't really seem to know that. It's her big secret from the world. And then we have a character, Maud, who is in her 30s or 40s, and she meets the characters because she goes to Fellowship Point to press Agnes on writing an autobiography about her life and her inspiration, and trying to press from her who was the inspiration for the main character in her children's books, which was called Nan. And then that creates another subplot with a surprise at the end. But it just felt wholesome. I really loved that the main protagonists in this novel were 8-year-old women. I think they had so much to say. I definitely think we need older characters in novels represented like this. They were the stars of this novel, and as they should be. And it didn't have a lot of plot, but I didn't need that, because I really felt that the author had created Fellowship Point as such a strong sense of place that I felt like I was there. And there was a use of Agnes's diaries and letters throughout the kind of middle section of the novel, and that really pushed the story forward as well, because I was desperate to read those bits. So for such a big book, it was so engaging and it was so just delightful to read. So I've decided that it's going in second place at 4.5 stars, because it didn't knock Demon Copperhead off its perch by any means, but I just loved it so much more than Nightcrawling, Trust, or The Marriage Portrait. I just enjoyed being in that world, and it was so much nicer in contrast to some of the darker books. So my final ranking for this round stands at in first place is Demon Copperhead, in second place is Fellowship Point, in third place is The Marriage Portrait, in fourth place is Trust, in fifth place is Nightcrawling, and in sixth place is The Book of Goose. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.